Welcome back. In this video, I'm just going to share some footage of me making the shoe rack that I built, which there's the image of it you see on your screen now. It's not the most beautiful shoe rack in the world, but it holds shoes and it's not ugly. I will just say if I was living by myself, I would have just made this out of 2x4s or maybe a couple of 2x4s and a couple of sheets of plywood. But my wife wouldn't have let that sit inside our house. Come to think of it, if I was living by myself, I wouldn't need a shoe rack because I would just have 2 pairs of shoes. But anyway, we have 2 children and my wife, of course, has shoes. There in the background of this photo, you can see there's some shoe holders that we bought from IKEA that are attached to the wall. And they hold some shoes too. But we had several just sitting here on the tile next to the front door. So I wanted a shoe rack. Before I get into the footage, I will just say that I made this without using any metal fasteners, just dowels and wood glue. And I did most of it without any power tools. I did use an electric drill to drill the holes for the dowels, but all the cutting I did with a handsaw, and all the smoothing of the boards I either did with a little block plane or sandpaper. So it was just a little personal challenge that I set for myself when making this shoe rack. Here I am using the hand plane, or a block plane I should say, to smooth off these boards. These boards are kind of ugly, but they're reclaimed. I had bought a dishwasher not long before that, and the box of the dishwasher was braced with these kind of rough boards, and they had glue stuck on them and bits of cardboard stuck to them with glue because they were stuck inside that box to give it rigidity. When I put that box in recycling, I first ripped these boards out and decided to use them as part of this. So I'm using a little block plane to smooth off some pretty rough edges on these boards, and it was one of my first times to actually use the block plane on a board that I was actually going to use in a project. So I did have a couple of rough times, and I made some marks, and I'm cutting these boards to the correct length. I did start with the little drawing, but I don't think I have any video or photos of the sketch plan that I made. And you can see here that all of these pieces of those boards that I have made are all of the correct size. The next thing I did was try to lay out the positions of the boards as they would finally go. I'm using the reclaimed boards that I just showed you in the previous footage as the parts that the longer rails rest on. The longer rails were boards that I bought and cut in half. I don't remember what type of wood they were. I think they were a hardwood like aspen or maybe a white oak. And that was the only expensive part of this project, were those long 1x2s that I used to make the horizontal rails. So anyway, I put some shoes here to kind of gauge what it would look like and how deep it needed to be from front to back. Of course, my shoes are the largest. And then I began making marks, and based on each board has a slightly different shape, a little bit of a different warp, a little bit of a different cup. And so I arranged them and marked which ones were which. So when I started gluing them together, I would know which ones to put in which spot. I used a stopper on the drill bit to drill the holes for the dowels so that the bit wouldn't go too far. Of course, I didn't want to drill into my table. I just wanted to go deep enough to get the dowels in. And there's me drilling some of the first holes for the wooden dowels. And then the dowels could hold that board in place while I got the next board's holes drilled for the dowels. I did just buy a package of long dowel rods that I then measured by hand and cut by hand into approximately the right length. I believe these were 1/4-inch dowels. And then later, after gluing them in place, I would cut them off. But here I'm just cutting the 1-inch sections of that dowel rod to make the dowels for myself. And then I used a little bit of sandpaper to smooth off where I had cut so that it would slide into the hole more easily. Basically, the top shelf of this shoe rack is exactly the same as the bottom shelf, and then just propped up there with end posts, I should say. I did have a little trouble when starting to glue it together. Some of the dowel holes didn't quite match up as well as I thought they should have. Apparently, the board had moved just slightly when I went from drilling one hole to the next. So in a couple of cases, I had to use an F-style clamp to help press the dowel down into the hole, and I think in at least one case I had to re-drill a hole for the dowel. Some of the dowels fit in so perfectly that I probably wouldn't have needed glue. I think they would have held this thing together without the glue. But in other cases they were really loose, so I did put glue in all the holes, and then used some free weights to help hold the boards down while the glue dried. Again, the dowels were so tight that I think it would have held it in place without the weights, but just in case, I put the weights there until I was sure the glue had set. And after a little while, I came by with a little flush cut saw that I picked up from the Jonathan Katz Moses store. If you watch any DIY or woodworking channels on YouTube, you've probably heard of him. It's also the store that I bought that apron from that I'm wearing in this footage. But that little saw has come in really handy, and I've put a playing card there from an old deck of playing cards to help protect the wood while I saw off the tops of those dowels. And of course, later came by with some sandpaper to smooth that all out. And here I've set the end posts in place. They're not attached in any way. They're just resting on their ends, which fortunately I sawed them at a right angle enough so that they would stand up on their ends. And I was trying to figure out how to attach them. I didn't want to just attach them on the sides. So what I decided to do was on the bottom to cut a notch so that the shelf would fit into that notch and kind of hold itself in place there. And then I also drilled through the side posts for dowels. Took a lot of moving things around and measuring, and then here I have marked where I want the notches to be, and I'm using, again, a handsaw to cut part way through the board to make this notch. And then once I had the end and the beginning of the notch cut, I cut through the middle of the notch so it would be easier to chisel out that the part of the board that I didn't want there. I'm sure there's a name for it, I just don't know what it is. And here I'm using a chisel and mallet to chip out that excess waste that I just mentioned. And a little flush cut saw to smooth the edges of the notch. I kept holding it up against the shelf and it wouldn't quite fit in, so I'd have to take it off and saw or sand or chisel away just a little bit more until it fit. In the end, one of them fit really tightly, perfectly, and the other one was a little loose. But again, I was going to use a dowel through the post with some glue, so it was going to work out. And here I'm putting together the other shelf. I don't remember if I made the top one or the bottom one first or if it mattered. I think it did matter, but not by much. They should have been identical. Of course, there's going to be minor discrepancies between the two because I was doing most of this by hand. And the second one went very easily compared to the first one because I'd already done it once, so I knew what I was doing. But here I'm having to use pliers to pull out one of the dowels that didn't go all the way in so I could reposition it. Okay, now that I have the two shelves, I decided to, since I didn't have a post in the middle, I didn't think the shoes would be heavy enough to press down the middle, but I decided to put a support post there just in case. And I ended up cutting a couple of notches there in the end of this post so that it would rest diagonally between the bottom shelf and the top shelf. And I made it just a little bit too long, so I'm using a flush cut saw to correct how long that little notch was, or whatever the opposite of a notch is, because the bottom of this post is going to have to slide down between two of the rails on the bottom shelf. And there you can see me trying to fit it into place, and it worked. And I had decided that that rail there in the middle of the top shelf would provide a spot to scrape somebody's hand, especially a child's hand, if they were putting shoes on the bottom shelf of the shoe rack, so I decided to cut that in a diagonal. So here I am using a handsaw to cut that diagonal triangular piece off, and had to finish it off with a flush cut saw so that it would be smooth, and of course sanded later. Okay, and this is basically what it's going to look like. This is looking from the back of the shoe rack. And you can see that I have just fitted the posts on there with the dowels just to make sure that it all fit. So I put them all on with dowels, and as you can see, I'm holding some of them in place with clamps while I get the glue here, put the dowel through into the middle of the notch, and I have a notch there at the top as well. So here I'm applying glue all over that top notch, and then I put glue in the bottom notch around where the dowels will go, and kind of brush it around to smooth out the glue, and then fit it into place. Hopefully in this you can see that the notch at the bottom fits right there on that bottom shelf, and on the top the notch just goes up against the top shelf so that the post won't stick up above the top of the shoe rack. I'm using a pair of pliers as a hammer, which isn't the best idea, but there we go. Once again, ended up using a clamp to get the dowel to push all the way in, which is a handy solution if it turns out you need that. The F-style clamp just squeezes the dowel right into where it's supposed to go. And then, of course, I just kept the clamp there to hold that in place while the glue was drying. That was one difficult thing about this project, was figuring out where to fit all the clamps to hold these oddly shaped posts and rails together while the glue dried. And basically just repeated that process with each of the other 4 posts until I had each of them glued in. And then, of course, at the end, I gave it one final go over with sandpaper, making sure all the dowels were flush cut, etc. And then I put coats of clear polyurethane over the whole thing. I did the full gloss, I believe, but most of that soaks into the wood. Then you sand off just a little bit to make it smooth, and then add one final coat. Once it's dry, the shoes sit on there no problem. I did get a couple of those little adhesive padded, I guess, felt feet to stick on the bottom of each post so that this thing won't scrape up the tile in our entryway. And that's basically it. Here's one shot of the shoe rack sitting in our entryway looking toward the front door. I think it looks pretty nice. It holds 8 pair of shoes. If it were all my shoes, I think it would only hold 6 pair because mine are a little bit wider than the kids' and the wife's shoes, but since only 2 of those pair are mine, the 2 at the upper left there, then it holds 8 pair of shoes. Now mine would fit underneath, but just because the tongues there of my hiking boots stick up a little high, they're easier to get from the top, but everybody else's shoes easily fits on the bottom, and it's worked out pretty well for us over the last few months. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Before I made this shoe rack, I looked up quite a few YouTube videos on how to make a shoe rack because I wasn't sure. I had no idea what to do, and all the ones that I found were either overly fancy, using mahogany or really seriously expensive and heavy hardwoods, or they were the really cheap kind, like how to use a single 2x4 to make a three-decker shoe rack, or all these kind of things, or use pallet wood, reclaimed pallet wood to make a free shoe rack. And then they would use a $1,000 table saw or something to cut the pallet wood, and power sanders and dust collectors and all these things. I don't have really expensive tools, and I decided not to use most of them anyway. And also I just used regular wood here. This isn't something fancy like mahogany or other expensive hardwoods, and it's also not something really trendy right now like reclaimed pallet wood. But again, some of those boards were reclaimed from my dishwasher box. That's not something I'm really proud of. It was just information. But anyway, the shoe rack looks nice and it holds shoes. I'll see you in the next one.